Assalamu alaikum everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to the Abrahamic Family House and to the first ever lecture in our new speaker series, AFH Dialogue. The AFH Dialogue brings this mission to life, welcoming a series of expert speakers to explore the power of connection across diverse fields from social science, culture, and arts. I am honored to be introducing Dr. Timothée Baur, Professor of Archaeology at UAE University. Dr. Baur is one of our UAE's foremost archaeologists. As an expert in archaeology and history of the Arabian Gulf, who has been based in the UAE for 15 years. This is a particularly exciting time for us to hear from Dr. Baur, as the recent years have brought to light incredible series of archaeological discoveries across the UAE. Discoveries which remind us that the interfaith dialogue and the peaceful coexistence have been central to our culture since ancient times. As Dr. Baur lecture will show, the UAE has welcomed travelers, traders, and nomadic tribes to all culture and religion of millennia, with a rich culture of early Christian communities. We are proud that the Abrahamic Family House embodies this long legacy of dialogue at the heart of the DNA in the region. There will be an opportunity for question and answers. Please help us welcome together Dr. Timothée on stage.
Thank you very much. Beautiful, thank you. So, first of all, yes, perfect. Okay, so thank you all very much for coming tonight to this lecture. Wonderful to be here again in Abu Dhabi at the Abrahamic Faith Center, and looking forward very much to talking to you tonight about the latest discoveries at Siniya Island in the Emirate of Al-Quwain. So, some of you may already have heard of the discovery of the monastery. It's been in the press quite a lot, and I thought maybe I could explain a little bit about the circumstances in which the monastery was discovered, because this, I think, sort of reveals the archaeological process in action, and I think it's kind of a nice way to sort of begin the lecture and introduce you to the site. So, Siniya Island is up here in the kind of the northern part of the lagoon of Al-Quwain. As you can see, it's got these sort of fingers which project south, and basically this has created a perfect sort of environmental niche for human settlement over the past several hundred years. Up here in the northeasternmost peninsula, we found two major sites which I'm going to be talking about today: the monastery, and then slightly to the south, a settlement which is extremely important for the regional archaeology. So basically, in the winter of 2021, a team from the Tourism Archaeology Department in Al-Quwain were digging on a site at the northeastern area of the island. This was prompted really because of Sheikh Majid bin Saud al-Mu'alla, who was personally interested in the island of Siniya because of stories that he'd heard that the island was the original place where the Al-Ali settled and established their emirate in the remote past. He believed that here on the island he would find the fort, the mosque, established by his great ancestor Majid I, his namesake in fact, in the early 18th century. So he set his archaeologists to dig a prominent mound covered with rubble, and they revealed a series of small walls, and they were slightly puzzled because it didn't look like a mosque, and it didn't look like a fort, and they really didn't know what it was. So the reports were kind of passed around a little bit, and they went off to the Ministry of Culture, where they reached the desk of Peter Hellier, who sadly died a year or so ago, but he was very much involved with archaeology. He was passionate about archaeology, and he also didn't quite understand what these images were, and so he contacted me, and we went up to Siniya Island together to have a look in person at this. And I said to him, look, this is quite clearly a church. And Peter got very excited, of course, because he'd been involved with the discovery of not one but two churches, the other being Sir Ben Yas back in the 1990s. But when we looked at these sort of drone images, and you know, at the area which had been excavated up to this point at the end of the the 2021 winter season, you could see what I thought was perhaps the nave here, and then an aisle here, and that presumably then there'd be another kind of aisle over here in this kind of unexcavated area, what we call the bulk in archaeology, and that probably it was going to look rather like this on the right. You can see here a plan of the church found at Al-Qusur in Kuwait. So that's what I thought we had, and you can see the architectural plan is very similar indeed. But archaeology is something which you can never really second guess, and when we began to dig in the next winter in 2022, we found something rather different. Not a tripartite basilica, but a single-aisled chapel surrounded by monastic buildings. And this is how it looked at the end of 2022. So what I want to do to begin with then is sort of explain to you what it is we have discovered over the past few years, 2021, right up until earlier this year, 2024. We've had now 4 years inclusive working on this site. So I think it's important to set out sort of what it is we've found first, and then having sort of given you this sort of quick guide to the monastery, we can start to talk about some other perhaps more interesting questions about when it was established and who built it and why it was built, why it was abandoned, and all of those really fascinating questions which really, I think, pull us into the regional history at a key moment in time. This is transitional between the end of antiquity and the rise of Islam. So a major monument in world history, in regional history, which we can situate these buildings. So let's begin then with the guides to the monastery and the most important part, the chapel. So this is the chapel. Essentially, you can see we have the nave, originally built with sort of benches around the side, and then in here we have the sanctuary, which would have had an altar fitted into a socket at the end here. The altar, I think, probably would have stood to about waist height and may have been a sort of wooden cabinet and may, in fact, have had been some sort of a reliquary. It's quite common, actually, in these late antique churches to have the bones of a saint interred within, and perhaps we can imagine that there was some local saint who was perhaps stored in this cabinet, the altar, and when the site was abandoned, it was taken with them. They took the remains with them, they took the altar with them, because this was the focal point of the church and the communal identity of the people worshipping here. Now, this is not by any means a unique building. There are, in fact, several single-aisled churches known from the Gulf region. The first of these, most clearly, is up at Al-Qusur in Kuwait. You can see here. It's been argued as well that the Hajj monastery on the southern coast of Iran, which is over here, actually has at its core a single-aisled chapel, and that the two aisles and narthex which surround it, being open, were more like corridors to emphasize the sanctuary within. But that, I think, is a little bit debatable. But certainly, it might have started off life as a single-aisled chapel. And the other thing, of course, is Siniya Island. Now, if you read the reports of Geoffrey King from the late 1990s, he explicitly states that Siniya Island started off as a single-aisled chapel, which was added to ultimately create a tripartite basilica. Okay? So I think we have three potential parallels for the site in Siniya. A single-aisled chapel, therefore, is not unusual and is part of the architectural tradition of the region. Now, I think what's really remarkable about this is that the excavation of the sanctuary revealed the material culture of Christian ritual preserved in situ. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, essentially, you have all of the objects that are used by Christians in the Mass. On Sundays, you'll go to church and meet the priest, and he gives them the sacrament. We have these large glass chalices in which wine is presented to the faithful, symbolizing the blood of Christ. Bread is also given to the faithful symbolizing the body of Christ. This is essentially a reconstruction of the Last Supper. And in fact, we found just next door to this chapel a small oven which was used for the baking of the bread to be used in the Holy Communion. Wine, of course, very important, and here we have basically a kind of basin which was used for the mixing of wine. In those days, wine was quite thick and syrupy, and you had to mix it with water to make it palatable and drinkable. So the wine jars, these probably actually Nabiz date wine being brought in from southern Iraq. These jars had been brought in, they'd been tapped, mixed with water, made palatable, and then the chalices had been dipped into the basin and the wine presented to the faithful. This basin at some point sprang a leak because things break as people use them, and so they started then to use these large glazed jars which they positioned on top of the basin to continue the use in this area. These glazed jars are clearly associated with wine, and it's really fascinating. In fact, there are hadith prohibiting Muslims from using turquoise glazed vessels because they are associated with the drinking of wine. So this is really fascinating, where you have a kind of sort of contemporary description of material culture in the religious literature of Islam. But also then we have this lamp. Now the lamp, this is a little brass lamp, which is described in the liturgies of the Syriac church. You have these liturgies, they read like sort of the scripts of plays, First of all, you do this, and then you do this, and then you light the lamp, and it symbolizes this, and then you sort of pass it around. And so essentially what you have here are objects which were used in the Mass. Now, I think that's really remarkable because so far as I'm aware from the archaeological record, this has never been found. This has never been found in the Gulf before, and it's incredibly rare in any kind of archaeological context that you'd find this stuff, okay? So essentially, this was just left behind when the people moved on, and then, 1,500 years later, the archaeologists turned up and dug it all up. So again, there is this sort of further evidence for the Eucharist. I mean, this is the oven I was talking about. It's positioned just here. And again, they found exactly the same thing in Al-Qusur. So, there is definitely a kind of a plan, a prototype, which the people on Siniya and the people at Al-Qusur were shared, as part of a shared culture in the region. And these are kind of some examples for you. I mean, here's a kind of modern priest, dipping the wafer in the wine. And this, by the way, is from the Greek Orthodox Church. They have very specific kind of communion bread. I mean, it's actually stamped with all sorts of symbols and things. And that's the kind of stuff that was being produced in this little oven up here. The other thing is we have these really nice parallels for the lamp. Now, these are from the Benaki Museum in Athens, which I visited a year or so ago. And basically, these are from Egypt, ultimately, and they're from this sort of 6th, 7th centuries, so very much the same sort of period as Siniya Church. Now, anybody who is interested in ancient Christianity starts to read, and very quickly you'll discover that there are all these different sects, and there are all these different kind of understandings of Christian theology. And when you read this stuff, you kind of feel that these sects were kind of deeply opposed to each other, and they sort of were sort of fighting each other and things like that. And to a certain extent that was true, but I think it's also worth stressing that there was a shared Christian experience across the region. In fact, monasticism in the Gulf traces its origin back to Mar Augen, who was basically an Egyptian saint who had lived in the eastern desert of Egypt and came to Mesopotamia and brought the habit of monasticism to the Gulf. Whether or not he ever existed is open to debate. Certainly this is the legendary origin of monasticism, which attempted to basically place the Gulf tradition in a line of descent with that of Egypt, with the Desert Fathers, St. Anthony, St. Paul, Pachomius, these kind of guys who had invented monasticism in Egypt. So the fact that we have a lamp which is sort of basically done in the same style, possibly even imported from Egypt, I think is a sort of material representation of that same looking to Egypt as a source of monastic inspiration. Now, one of the things that was asked me when I identified this as a church was, well, hang on, if it's a church, why haven't we got any crosses? everyone knew about Siniya, right? They knew of this beautiful decorated stucco. This is it here on the left with these elaborate Eastern crosses. Well, not all churches were elaborately decorated. This one here, this is from the Oxford excavations at the Arab capital of Al-Hira in southern Iraq, a Christian Arab kingdom that flourished in the centuries before the rise of Islam. And you can see here that just there's a crucifix, there's a cross, scratched into the plaster. And Talbot Rice, the excavators, actually had to colour the plate to show us that there is something there, because the scratch was so ephemeral and really not visible even to the camera. So our preservation at Siniya probably doesn't go up that far. It only kind of goes up to about knee height. So essentially any kind of decorated plaster above that would have fragmented, would have collapsed, would have fallen to powder and eventually kind of disintegrated, right? So we haven't got any decorated stucco. It's not the same kind of establishment as Siniya, which is interesting. It's more, I think, of a kind of a vernacular tradition oriented towards a kind of a settlement community than a sort of a retreat where you kind of meditate and pray. So, it doesn't have that same high quality visual material culture. It's much more rustic, and I think whatever designs there were on the plaster have just disintegrated. They've not survived, and I don't think they're ever going to be found. So around the chapel, we have a series of communal buildings. And this really is what distinguishes this as a monastery, because monasticism is about holy men coming together to live a life of prayer and meditation. This type of religious experience is known as Cenobitic monasticism. Essentially, people would live in relative isolation, scattered around the monastery, but they would come together for communal events, communal prayer, communal meals. So they had their sort of their isolation out here, and we'll look at those monks' cells in a minute. But then at the heart of it all was this communal complex where people would come together and pray and share meals, as indeed they had been taught to do by Jesus of Nazareth himself, who broke bread with his disciples. Okay, so this is the kind of the tradition which I think is encapsulated in these buildings. So here we have the original chapel, and then there's a whole series of buildings which are added to it over the next 100 years or so, including, well, there's a number of things which are interesting. First of all, they build the prothesis and the diaconicon either side of the sanctuary. These are kind of elements of the kind of part of an elaboration of church architecture, which can be traced back to Justin II in the late 6th century. So they've kind of added those bits. Essentially, this is where you'd kind of bake the bread and prepare the communal, the meal for the mass. And then over here, this is where you keep all the kind of the relics, the equipment which was needed for the mass. There are also kind of special kind of washing basins here, where you'd wash the chalice and all these other things, because they are sacred objects. You're not just going to wash them with all your other kind of bowls and things. So they have like a special place for washing and ritual purity. Other things, and this is very important for the monastery, is this: the refectory. Okay, it's essentially a large rectangular building with sort of benches around the side, and this is where people would come together. It functioned in some ways like a majlis. People would come and discuss the kind of needs of the community, but it's also a kind of place where they would get together and they would sort of they would sing hymns or maybe chant psalms. It's a place also where they probably shared meals. So really, this is their kind of the communal space par excellence of the monastery. We also have a cistern used for the storage of fresh water. There may or may not be a well on Siniya Island. We've not really positively identified it. And fresh water may actually have been brought by boats from outside. Again, suggesting that this monastery is part of a kind of wider network, and that the people living here were dependent on that network for their way of life. What I think is also fascinating is up here, we have this font, which we'll come back to shortly. So the font is positioned immediately behind the sanctuary. It is, I think, a baptismal font for full immersion baptism. Okay? So today Christians mostly kind of sort of dab some water on a baby's head as a sort of symbolic kind of baptism. But in the early church, based on the model of John the Baptist, whose head incidentally resides in Damascus, John the Baptist is the one who baptizes Christ. He dips him in the River Jordan and he emerges pure. And so full immersion baptism is fundamentally part of early Christian ritual. It's no surprise really to have it here. There are parallels. This is a solid marble one from Hagia Sophia, which is perhaps kind of stretching things a bit, but you get the idea. It's the same sort of dimensions. Here, actually, I think this is in modern Jordan, actually, with a Christian sect baptizing in the traditional way. But I think what's fascinating about baptism is that it appears in the Syriac literature. We have a whole series of Aramaean holy men. Ahudama, for example, who's a Mesopotamian monk. He goes off baptizing the Arabs. Okay? A lot of these guys, as we're told here, he founded churches and inclined the hearts of the Arabs to the love of God. Okay, so there is, I think, a baptismal movement in the region in this period. Also, after the rise of Islam, there's a really fascinating moment which Al-Baladhri talks about, in which the Christian Arab tribe of Taghlib refuse to live in the Umayyad Caliphate because the Umayyad caliphs are trying to forbid the ritual of baptism, right? So the Taghlib just kind of get up and move. They leave, they move from Al-Jazira, they go over and they live in the Byzantine realm. They basically leave the Dar al-Islam and go and live in the Byzantine territories. So baptism was an important rite to them and to their communal identity. So we have these historical sources, and now I think we have a sort of a material representation of this, which again is important because this is the first time we've found a baptismal tank in Eastern Arabia. The refectory, which I talked about already, is something, again, very important. You get the idea here with the benches, and you can actually see the kind of the wear on the benches as people have sat there over several decades, hundreds of years. This, I think, really is probably the most important building at the monastery, aside from the chapel itself, because this was really the focus of communal life. Okay, so if we have this communal aspect to the monastery, we then also have this private and quietist aspect where people would go and retreat and would get away from everybody and dedicate themselves to the worship of God. So all around this monastic court, we have scattered cells for the monks. This is Siniya with the monastery, and then all of the cells of the monks sort of scattered around. This is Siyabanias with the monastery, and then cells for the monks scattered around. And this is El Qusur with the monastery, and then cells for the monks scattered around. So I think you get the idea that in every single one of these sites, pretty much, you have this Cenobitic model of a communal core, and then this area of personal retreat where you can basically commune with God and escape the kind of the babble of people. And here's a nice drone shot. You can see that there's a whole series of these. We've got the church and the monastery, another interesting building here, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then all around, we have these cells of the monks. And what do they look like? Well, they're very simple buildings. They're mostly 1 or 2 rooms. They're not very big, actually. They're probably about 2 to 3 meters wide and about 3 to 5 meters long. You can sort of tell with the dimensions that they were probably roofed. And in Arabian architecture, through the centuries, there's a repeated pattern that you can build rooms as long as you want, but you can only build them to a certain width because of the availability of the roofing material, right? So these would essentially have been the trunks taken from palm trees, maybe mangrove poles, laid across on top and then kind of covered with the palms. So as you can see, they're pretty basic cells. There's no floor, there's no, they probably had some sort of rush mats or something. There's a hearth in this one to keep warm in winter. It would have been dark and smoky, most likely, And probably people only really slept there in the winter and probably spent the rest of the year outside. And we see the same kind of pattern with other monasteries in the region. So if you think here, what we've got essentially is a sort of bipartite building. If you ignore this bit, which is an extension, it probably had a kind of covered area for sleeping and an open area, small courtyard for living and working. And that, I think, is really what you've got here in Sir Banias. If you take away these two, which is an extension, you have, again, a covered space and an open courtyard. Okay. Similarly, you have something similar in Al-Qusur, but I think what's interesting about Al-Qusur is the architecture in general, not just of the church, but of the cells for the monks, is more elaborate. And I think the reason for this is that you are closer to Mesopotamia, you are closer to the great wellspring of urban civilization in the ancient Middle East. So there's another building which we discovered at Siniya, which I think is particularly interesting and really kind of open to speculation. But essentially you can see just here, a little bit away from the communal complex, we have this large courtyard building. Now, the scale of it is actually fairly analogous to the monastery itself. So this is kind of an important building, quite clearly, because of its size. It's something that's actually been expanded. It's been expanded twice over the period of occupation of the monastery. And I think there are some interesting parallels here. I mean, this is not an exact parallel, but it's here at the monastery of Kharj in southern Iran. The French excavators identified this as an infirmary, a place where people who were sick would go and get treated and would be separated from the rest of the community. But actually, I think that's not the right interpretation. And when you read the late antique texts, the Syriac texts, the role of the abbot, the head of the monastic community, comes through very clearly. The abbot had all sorts of responsibilities. He was not just the leader of the community, but also he was the host. Anybody who came to visit would be hosted in the abbot's house. We have this, there's a nice 7th century Syriac text, the history of Mar Yonan, a sort of hagiography of a Gulf saint, and he visits different monasteries and he lives in the abbot's house, right? So I think there is kind of this role of the head of the community has these sort of roles, has these responsibilities, these obligations, and that I think kind of helps us explain this building. So we have, I think, then not just the church and the monastery and the monks, but we also have the abbot, okay? And in fact, if you want to push it, you could argue that this was perhaps the bishop's house. Now, today perhaps we have this idea of bishops as being very kind of powerful, lords of the church with their palaces and whatnot. But I think in this sort of period, the bishops were, I think, much closer to their flock, much more humble, much more politically engaged as well, actually. They're quite boisterous, the bishops. They're constantly disagreeing with each other and splitting from the church, then coming back and writing letters to each other, kind of, talking about all of this stuff. And so we have a whole series of references to the bishop of Beit Mazunia. Beit Mazunia, in Syriac, basically it means Oman, right? Mazun, Oman, same thing. Whereas Oman, well, it's basically southeastern Arabia, including the Emirates and the northern part of today's Sultanate of Oman. So the Bishop of Oman appears in the Acts of the Synods of the Nestorian Church from about 544 through to 676. So this period is when we have historical attestation for a Bishop of Oman. And actually this is, as we'll come to see, pretty much exactly the period in which the Siniya monastery is thriving, okay? So it's not exactly a smoking gun, but it is a circumstantial argument that you can make suggesting that perhaps this building was the residence of the abbot, the bishop, in fact, of Oman. And in fact, Oman is a name which kind of has deep roots in this part of the world. It appears in an inscription from Maleha from the 3rd century BC. It appears in the Periplus Maris Erthrei, a Greco-Roman text about 2,000 years ago. And in fact, this source talks about Oman as a port of the Gulf Coast of the Emirates, which has been identified with Edur, quite reasonably, I think, given the amount of trade goods found at the site. Whereas Edur, it's right next to Siniya in the lagoon of Al-Quwain. So I think essentially you see a continuity of the name, Oman, and then the Bishop of Mazun. It's all the same place, and I think all the same person. So with those that sort of overview of the monastery complete, I think we should turn perhaps to some of the more exciting and interesting questions, like when was it built, why was it built, those kind of things. So first of all, there is not really a single point of inception. It's not like this was suddenly established and boom, right? It's something that grew and developed in a series of phases over potentially about 200 years, okay? So essentially what we have is a single freestanding rectangular building here, which is added to create a church, a chapel. That's then expanded again significantly by the extension of these diaconicon and prothesis and the refectory and cistern. That really turns it into a monastery. And then there's a second phase of expansion as more buildings are added. Interestingly, the font appears to be one of the last things built at the site of the monastery, as if to say maybe something's happening in the region and that there's another kind of added incentive to kind of bring people into Christianity or keep people in the Christian faith. Again, we'll come back to that. But it's important to note that the monastery develops over time, that there is originally there is the church, and then the monastery is added to it. Okay. And what we can do then, having established this sequence, is start to date it. Now, we can use ceramics to date things, but a perhaps more accurate and absolute form of dating is radiocarbon. These give us a date range. Okay, it's not 100% accurate, but I think it is useful. So what is particularly useful for us is that we found embedded in the preparation surface for the floor of the monastery, okay, that's the phase of expansion that expands the church into a living monastery, a piece of charcoal that when analyzed in the lab produced a date range between the 560s and 630s. Now if we take the very latest date for that, right, in 634 or 641, depending on how you calibrate the data, that gives us a terminus antiquem for the construction of the church. The church must have been built before that date. So that pushes us back. Well, how far we don't know exactly, but I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that the church was established around the turn of the 7th century, around the, say, 600 Christian era. Yeah? So that makes this the best dated of these monasteries in the Arabian Gulf. So far, there's been a bit of a controversy about when exactly they're established, but I think it's really fascinating that the expansion of monasticism in the Gulf is in fact a parallel process to the rise of Islam. Right? I think people have got a bit confused about this. Are they built before or after Islam? Well, actually, it's neither. They're contemporary. It's a parallel process, and that I think opens up this debate to a whole range of fascinating speculation. The other thing we can do is place this physical manifestation of monasticism in the kind of broader flourishing of Syriac literature. And essentially you see that from the late 6th century, there's a sudden massive growth in historical evidence. We have a whole series of synods, of powerful bishops and abbots who establish monastic practices in Eastern Arabia. We have the beginning of the acceptance of Christianity by the Sasanian Persian Empire, which dominated the region in this period. And around 600 really is a moment in time when the great Persian Sasanian Emperor Khusro marries his Christian wife and starts dealing with the Christians in a kind of greater way. hitherto they'd been persecuted. Right? There's a whole series of persecutions that happen in the Persian Sasanian Empire, but around this period in the late 6th century, they are accepted into the community. They finally enter civil society, and I think that is important for understanding why all of these different monasteries are being built in this period, because essentially, I think they probably all date to the same sort of 7th, 8th century sort of episode, and I think you can see that this is in some ways a response to the acceptance of Christianity in the Eastern late antique empire. And I think in particular, the conversion of the Arab Lakhmid kingdom of Al-Hira, which dominated this region, the conversion of the Lakhmids to Christianity around 600, also I think is not insignificant when thinking about the sort of circumstance in which these monasteries were built. So in other words, I think you have a kind of cultural tipping point, right, in which Christianity ceases to be a persecuted minority religion and gains admittance into mainstream civil society. And it's exactly this period that these monasteries are being built. So we can also think a little bit about how this church, this monastery, fits into the historical geography of Eastern Arabia. We do have glimpses from the Syriac sources in late antiquity and from the Arabic sources in the early Islamic period, glimpses of places in the past which we don't always know where they are. Some of them can be identified. Al-Hajar, for example. Hajar, well, where was that? Probably Al-Hassa in eastern Saudi Arabia. But there are other sites which are kind of a bit more open to interpretation, and I think with a little bit of analysis, we can start to place them here in the Emirates and make some identifications of exactly where this was. So, first of all, let's have a think about Siyah Bani Yas. This is the kind of sister site to Siniya in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. Another island with the monastery down here. This has been identified with the mysterious Black Island, which is mentioned in the hagiography of Mar Yonan, Saint Jonah, in the kind of 7th, 8th century, same sort of period as these are being built. So the Black Island, people have suggested that it's Siyah Bani Yas, which, with the eye of faith, you can kind of squint at it and see that maybe this is the Black Island. But alternatively, I think it's interesting that Siniya Island, is actually made of black beach rock. Right? If you go and have a look there, right, the actual stone, the kind of stabilized sandbars, which kind of form the island, are black. Right? So I don't know if you want to read into that too much, but I think you could make a counter argument that maybe actually it's up in Siniya. The other thing which is interesting about this, we hear of a monastery of Mar Thoma, right? St. Thomas, the monastery of St. Thomas, situated on the Black Island. And I think this, for me, is where we start to kind of pull much more strongly towards Siniya. The monastery of Mar Thoma is situated on the coast of Mazun in the Syriac literature. But by the time we come to look at the early Islamic Arabic sources, we read about a place called Tu'am, which is situated on the coast of Oman, right? And I think it's basically the same place, mutatis mutandis, from Syriac into Arabic, Mar Thoma becomes Tu'am. And that, I think, is the kind of progression of this etymology. Te'om in Hebrew, To'ma in Syriac, Tu'am in Arabic becomes Thoma in Greek, which gives us the English European name Thomas. Yeah? Who was Thomas? He wasn't just anybody, it's not just a name. Thomas is one of the apostles of Christ. He is the apostle of the East. He is the founder of the Eastern Church in Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. Today, we still have the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, right, whose liturgy is still Syriac, which goes back to this ancient founding father. And Eusebius tells us, this is the great church historian, Thomas, so the tradition has it, obtained as his portion Parthia. Parthia meaning the Persian Empire, which was understood here to refer to all of these eastern lands. Okay? So I think we have then a good reason to imagine that the monastery on Siniya Island can be identified with the monastery of St. Thomas off the coast of the Gulf Coast of the Emirates, basically. Okay? Now, again, there's no smoking gun. We need an inscription, really, to kind of pull this together. But I think you can make a pretty good circumstantial argument to support this. And I think, again, this needs to be placed into a historical context. You know, why should there be a monastery on the Gulf Coast of the Emirates? Well, when you read the sources, all of the tribes here, with the exception of Al-Azd, were Christian at the time of the rise of Islam, right? So the Sama bin Lu'ay bin Ghalib of Quraysh, Christian. Abdul Qais of Rabi'a bin Nizar, Christian. Hanifa of Bakr bin Wa'il, Christian. The Banu Sa'd of Tamim, Christian. Right? These are all tribes which live in Tu'am. Right? Here's Yakut in Mujam al-Buldan, tells us which tribes live in Tu'am back in the day, and here they all are, Christian tribes. Right? So I think you can quite neatly situate the monastery of Siniya within the historical geography of late antiquity and early Islam. I think you can make a circumstantial argument for the identification of the settlement right next door as the principal settlement of Tu'am. And I think you can argue that the monastery of Siniya can be identified with the monastery of St. Thomas mentioned in the hagiographical literature. So it's not just an archaeological discovery, but it's actually led to a whole line of research and historical inquiry which leads us to essentially, resurrect the historical geography of the late antique Emirates. This really takes us a little bit further away from Siniya, but essentially we are able to reconstruct a Christian Arabian Gulf from the Syriac sources. And there's a whole series of sites. These are all sites mentioned in the Syriac sources which can be placed with varying degrees of confidence on the map. So this leads us to the final element of the discussion, which is why was it abandoned? When and why was the monastery abandoned? Well, first of all, we need to think about the date. The radiocarbon dates help us, but the ceramic assemblage in this case really helps us, and we can pinpoint it fairly accurately. We can say that the monastery was abandoned before the mid-8th century. There's certain types of pottery very commonly found in this part of the world which are absent here. And they can be dated to the second half of the 8th century, to the early Abbasid period. Their absence provides a terminus antiquem for the abandonment of the site. So 750, that's the date we're thinking of. Right? That's when it all finishes on this island. So what's happening in the kind of 150 years since the foundation of the church in around 600? Well, a whole series of things. The Sasanian Persian Empire implodes into civil war in the 620s. The Muslim Arabs of the Hijaz start their expansion across Arabia into the Fertile Crescent. Other Arab groups are also active, raiding the Persian Empire as it disintegrates. And I think it's not unreasonable to think that some of the local community participated in the Arab conquest of the Persian Empire. In fact, there is a whole series of historical sources which tell us about the participation of these tribes, which I've just been talking to you about. These tribes are involved in maritime raids on the province of Fars in southwestern Iran. They are important actually in they're a distracting force which allows the main Muslim army to come in from the other side, and they play a role in the Arab-Muslim conquest of Iran. Okay? So I think arguably some of the local people are joining in this new venture for all sorts of reasons, because it's exciting, because they can get rich, because they can do glorious deeds, and I think as they're getting swept up in the conquests and in the process converting to Islam. And as things settle down after the resolution of the second fitna, when Abdul Malik and the Marwanids basically establish for the first time an Arab-Muslim state, increasingly I think being Muslim becomes a mark of social superiority. It becomes something that people aspire to. And there are all sorts of tax reasons as well, but essentially I think as we start to see the emergence of a confidence powerful Arab Muslim state, symbolized here by such monumental buildings as the Dome of the Rock, or Walid's Mosque in Damascus, or the amazing gold dinar of Abdul Malik, the standing caliph, with his hand on his sword, ready to strike down his enemies, and the whip on his elbow, ready to punish those who err from the path. These symbols of a powerful, confident new civilization, I think, were seductive, and many people, I think, embraced Islam in this period. So I think the 8th century is kind of a tipping point. It's after the conquest, when things calm down, when there's a new social structure. That, I think, gives us the kind of framework for the social cultural change, the conversion from Christianity to Islam. But there are other elements to this story. Okay, we can talk about social cultural change, we can talk about political military elements, but I think also there are other things going on. In this period, between the 540s and the 760s, we have the first global pandemic, the Justinianic plague, which reoccurs pretty much every 15 years. Now, there are different estimates about how many people died in this period, but if it was anything like the Black Death in the later medieval period, you could say about a third of the population died, right? And people debate this, right? But clearly the Justinianic plague was a problem. And here at the cemetery, next to the monastery on Siniya Island, we found plague pits. We found mass graves. Graves, each one about sort of 3 to 4 meters in diameters, filled with dozens of bodies stacked on top of each other, disposed of quickly. We did osteological analysis of the bones. This is a forensic team from the University of Bologna. These people did not die a violent death. There are no cut marks on their bones. They were not killed in battle or massacred or anything like that. We're waiting for the pathogen analysis. Of course, you're always waiting for the results of the lab. But basically, you can make, again, a good argument. Why else would you bury large numbers of people in a pit? Okay, it's happening exactly the right time for the appearance of the Justinianic plague in the region. So I think perhaps this contributed to the decline of the monastery. Okay, people living in close proximity to each other, maybe in these communal kind of areas, spreading disease and succumbing to it. But I think the real kind of nail in the coffin for this Siniya community was the Abbasid invasion of Oman by the Caliph al-Safa. Now, this, I think it's important to stress, wasn't about Muslims against Christians. This was about Muslims against heretical Muslims, right? So you had a whole group of Muslims, the Khawarij, the rebels, people who basically went off into Eastern Arabia and kind of did their own thing. They didn't want to be part of the community. Those people thrived in Eastern Arabia, and eventually they started causing some problems. They started attacking people, raiding people. So the Caliph sent an army to deal with this problem. And so this army arrived on the Gulf coast of the Emirates, and they resorted to a form of collective punishment in which the coastal settlements were systematically picked off. And we're told, in fact, that there's one of the army of the Abbasids who's from Central Asia, and he brought with him a kind of new technology, a kind of Greek fire, basically oil that's set on fire and sprayed, and that they used this to destroy the Arish houses of the people living on the coast. So I think basically people ran away. They fled. There's this slow kind of long-term process of conversion as Islam becomes the dominant socio-cultural force in the region. There is also then the Justinianic plague, which kind of eats into the population, and it starts to dwindle over time. But I think finally the last thing which kind of goes wrong for these people is this invasion. And I think we know about the so-called the destruction of Julfa in this period, which is just up the road. That's in Ras Al Khaimah. That's like visible from Siniya. So I think people were terrified and they ran, basically. So I think this is the final act of the monastery of Siniya. It takes time for it to grow and it expand, and then it also takes time for it to sort of fade away and finally disappear. So the last thing really, and I know my time's just up, but the last thing really is, how do we think about this in terms of a legacy? What is the legacy of the Siniya monastery and the rediscovery of To'am? Well, I think we need to recognize that this is a lost chapter of Arab and Emirati history. The Arabian Peninsula in the century before the rise of Islam was mostly Christian. There were Jewish communities, but by this time most people had converted to Christianity, and you see it across the region. This is the capital, this is the palace of Abraha, the kind of Ethiopian, Yemeni general, and here you can see a Christian saint with his kind of beard and crucifix and this kind of imagery here, which we're going to come back to. But you know, this is Yemen, the great kingdom of the Himyarites, becomes a Christian kingdom in this period. The Ghassanids, the Ghassasina in Bilad al-Sham, ruled from the northern Hijaz right the way up through to the kind of frontiers of Turkey and Egypt, huge territory under their control. And they were great sponsors of church architecture. You can see here the shrine of Saint Sergius, who was a sort of patron saint of Arab Christianity in the Byzantine Empire, at the Ghassanid center of Rasafa in Syria. Here we have Arab sheikhs building monasteries in the lands of Palestine and Syria. And closer to home, the Lakhmids, the Manadhara, the great Arab Christian kingdom of southern Iraq, who we are told ruled the regions of eastern Arabia, including Oman, the region of today's Emirates and Sultanate. And there's a whole series of royal women, you know, Hind the Elder and Hind the Younger, who built monasteries in Al-Hira. And we see the churches which were discovered and the crosses which were found. So I think arguably what you could say about Siniya, going back to why it was built, who built it and why, was it the Nestorians, the church itself kind of coming and building, or was it a local Arab ruler building a monastery as a form of political legitimation? Right? The church conveyed political legitimacy to these rulers at a time when the Persian Empire is fragmenting, the Lakhmid Confederation is fragmenting. There are opportunities for local rulers to assert themselves and present themselves as legitimate rulers. How do you do that? You build a church, and a church gives you legitimacy. So again, I think we can situate this in a pattern of Christian Arab patronage in Eastern Arabia and the wider region. And this, I think, finally sort of sums it up. This is from Sir Banias, a vine scroll, and this is the same vine scroll from the palace of Abraha in Dhafar. And I think it shows you ultimately that this whole region, this whole Arabian Peninsula, is sharing in the Christian visual and material culture. So really that's all I have time for to talk to you about. But thank you very much for your patience, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Yeah, go on.
I'll go if nobody else wants to. So I'm confused, and I'm hoping you can help me out. You gave two basic origin stories for what Siniya might have been affiliated with. Either Christianity that's being sponsored. Thank you. Christianity that's being sponsored by the Sassanids in the early 7th century, or now in this last part that's some kind of successor to the Lakhmids, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if those two don't seem to be compatible, like it's either one or the other. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And I'm still fuzzy, and I shouldn't be, but I'm fuzzy on what kind of political organization is in the hinterlands, as to say, at this time period. Because if you're going to build a church on an island where you have to bring water in to keep people alive, that implies some larger sort of social infrastructure that's sustaining that. And it's not just being run out of southern Iraq or southern Iran, but it's more close to home. So if you could clarify a bit on that.
Sure, okay. So, first of all, we have the Sasanian Persian Empire, which rules in Iraq and Iran, and clearly also northeastern Arabia, the kind of regions of Al-Hassa up to Kuwait. And arguably, there's some sort of indirect rule in southeastern Arabia, the regions of the Emirates and Oman. That powerful empire was anti-Christian in the first few hundred years of its existence, and there was a whole series of anti-Christian persecutions. But towards the end of the 6th century, the Christians had become so powerful that they couldn't be ignored anymore. And under the reign of Khusro II, they are admitted into civil society. So the Sasanians did patronize major monasteries in Iraq. And the Lakhmids kind of copied them and also patronized monasteries in Al-Hira. So what I'm arguing is that there is an established pattern of patronage by the empire and their clients, and that as that empire starts to fragment and disintegrate in the 620s in a series of civil wars and foreign invasions, that local rulers who had been tributary to the Lakhmids, tributary to the Sasanians, saw an opportunity for dynastic aggrandizement. And there is kind of wider evidence for these figures, these phylarchs, in the Gulf Coast of the Emirates. So at Kush in Ras Al Khaimah, they found a murabba, right, a mud brick tower, built very much in a local East Arabian style, but absolutely full of imported Sasanian material culture, including weaponry. And I think you can interpret that as a military stronghold of a local big man who is in some ways tributary to the Sasanians, supported perhaps with material from the Sasanians, who exerts some sort of indirect role on their behalf, whether directly in association with them or through one of their more powerful Arab intermediaries. So I think it's all about patronage and opportunities for patronage as the empire fragments.
Thank you.
But that's one theory. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the bigger circle around the church, the community itself,
Mm-hmm.
were all Christians or they were mixed? And in terms of the language that was used, it was Arabic, but in terms of the church, is there any records that say that they were speaking Arabic? And I'm not talking about the modern Arabic, about the old Arabic and the old scripts of Arabic.
Okay. So first of all, the Arab identity. It seems clear that the Arabs or the local people are not Arabized really until about the 2nd century AD, which is quite late, because we have inscriptions from Leha and Edur, which are in Hassayetic, which is a kind of a regional dialect of Eastern Arabia named after Al-Hassa, where it was first discovered. And that is clearly not an Arabic language. It's not even a cousin of Arabic. Okay? But from the 2nd century on, we start to get Greco-Roman sources which describe the movement of Arab tribes. And there is also a kind of later folk memory of Arab migrations preserved in the early Islamic Arabic sources. And so putting the two together, you can sort of see the migration of Arab peoples through the peninsula from their original homeland in the northern Arabian kind of regions, down first into Yemen, then later into Southeast Arabia. Interestingly, the region of the Emirates and Oman is one of the last regions to be Arabized in the peninsula. Okay? So when did they start speaking Arabic? We don't know. And really, without inscriptions, there's no clear way to kind of answer that. But the kind of early Islamic sources from the 8th, more particularly the 9th, 10th centuries, they talk about Arab tribes in this region. You know, and the most famous one, of course, is Al-Azd. Now, Al-Azd, when they kind of get involved in the conquest, they end up in Iraq, in Basra in particular, and the other Arab tribes living in Basra kind of, you know, they tease them about not being proper Arabs, not speaking Arabic properly, right? There's a whole type of Arabic poetry, al-hijja, you know, this invective, right, which is pushed against Al-Azd. Oh, they're not real Arabs, they don't learn to speak Arabic properly. So arguably there you've got a kind of a sort of proxy data, evidence of an incomplete Arabization process in the sort of 8th, 9th centuries. And actually these local identities survive for hundreds of years after the rise of Islam. So we have in Yemen, for example, a really interesting inscription dated to the 9th century AD, which is a bilingual inscription in Musnad, which is the indigenous script, and in Arabic. Right? So you can see that these languages, these local identities continue after the conquest. Of course, Arab and Muslim shouldn't be conflated. And in terms of religious identity, that again is a big question. Certainly the later histories would like us to believe that the local people converted to Islam within the lifetime of the Prophet. That there were Omani merchants living in Medina who brought Islam back to this region. And there's an attempt to associate the origin of Islam in this region with Amr ibn al-Az, one of the companions of the Prophet. But really, I think when you look at the material evidence, there's no clear evidence for Islam in the Emirates or Oman until about the 8th century. We have 3 mosques, one at Jumeirah in Dubai, one at Al-Tawbah in Al Ain, and one recently discovered in the lagoon of Umm Al-Quwain at a site called Arafah on the coast. All of that's associated with kind of 9th, 10th century pottery, but arguably they're built in the 8th century. So I think Arabization begins in the 2nd century AD, is not yet complete at the time of the Arab conquests in the 7th and settlement in the 8th century. Islamization begins in the 7th century, but is not really, I don't think, complete until possibly as late as the 9th century. Yeah. So the 8th century is kind of the key one, where you get this sort of general, I think, tipping point of an Arab-Muslim identity in the region.
Thank you.
Do we have any idea about the relationship between the monastery and the population around? How did it work? Because it was sustainable? Because you said mangrove at some point, so the landscape was different. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something that Justin mentioned sort of as well. And I didn't really have time in this lecture to talk about the settlement because, you know, about a kilometre to the south of the monastery, we have a settlement, a big settlement, about 12 to 15 hectares. It's pretty sizable, densely packed houses. That seems to be that, you know, that the people living there were heavily involved with the pearling industry. They were trading with India, northwestern India, regions of Sindh in particular, in a big way. And arguably, I think that the wealth of the pearling industry either attracted the attention of the Nestorian church and these kind of local Arab rulers who wanted to kind of tax it, control it, or you could turn it around and say that the local people who are making money out of this pearling trade build the church as a symbol of communal pride. Yeah? So you can look at it in 2 different ways, right? But clearly the church and the settlement have either a symbiotic or a parasitic relationship, depending on your politics, but they're clearly very closely related. There isn't enough water, there isn't enough food on the island, they depended on trade, and it's not the monks doing the trade, right? It's the local community bringing them food, bringing them water as barakah, essentially, to receive blessings in return. And that is described in the historical literature of the period.
One more thing about conquest. And could it be like in Egypt, they joined the Arab of the new army against the Romans, the Byzantine Empire? Was it very short?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting subject, and it's something that my colleague Robert Hoyland's written a book about, actually, and called In God's Path, which is very well worth reading. And what he argues, actually, is that the fragmentation of the Persian Sasanian Empire in the 620s creates a kind of vacuum that draws in the Turks and the Arabs and other kind of surrounding peoples. And actually, I think we can start to think of a whole series of Arab conquests going on in parallel, with different local Arab rulers involved with this. And that then gets tidied up in the historiography once the conquests have been complete and the Amsar, the great cities, have been built and people are coming down to write the history of the Arab conquests. They start kind of pulling it all into the Islamic initiative, agency. But I think actually there are multiple strands of conquest going on. And clearly the local people living on the Gulf Coast of the Emirates were involved in raiding or invading the southern coast of Iran during this period of political confusion and fragmentation.
What about construction materials and construction know-how? Okay, so they will bring them food or water. Is there any idea just from where they get the stones or the walls, the mortar, who built it, the people living there or the people from the mainland coming to build every single room after an rice. Because, okay, so the roofs you mentioned that could be palm trunks. They we bring it from the mainland because you mentioned that they are not in the island. But from all the other materials and the mortar to join the stones and the plasters, locally done, locally know-how from what?
Okay, so what's really amazing about this lagoon environment is that many of the raw materials you need to build are locally available. So the main construction material is beach rock. Now, beach rock forms in the lagoon environment, and actually it's still quite a mysterious process. People are not totally sure how it happens, but essentially you need still water, and it's a sort of chemical concretion, which basically leads to the creation of this sort of laminate rock, which you can chip off and turn into building blocks. Right? So that's happening on the edge of these stabilized sandbanks in the lagoon. And in fact, if you talk to the older generation of people in Al-Quwain, they actually remember exporting this material to Jazirah al-Hamra, to Dubai, as a building material. Right? So it was used, it's quarried actually. Right? So you don't really think of a kind of, of a desert island as being a source of building materials, but it's there all along the coast, the beach rock forming. And of course, you've got quite a lot of coast because of this sort of concertina kind of shape of the island. Now, in terms of the mortar, the plaster, that is also totally ingenious because it's lime plaster. And what they're doing basically is recycling shell middens. So their number one industry is pearling. They collect the pearl oyster shells and they keep the pearls and they throw the shells away and they create these mounds. And then they subsequently come along and reprocess those mounds. They burn them in kilns, and we found the kilns on site. So they burn the shell and it produces the raw materials to make the lime mortar, which you can then use to kind of put your beach rock blocks together to create houses. And as for the roof, well, presumably there was some sort of contact with the interior. Pretty much all of the coastal communities of the Emirates had a kind of close relationship to the interior. If you think about all of the modern tribes, the Zab of Jazirah al-Hamra, for example, living on the coast, but also cultivating palms on the interior in Khat and migrating seasonally, the tahwil, moving backwards and forwards. So I don't think these communities existed in isolation. They were they were living together and sharing resources to be able to live in what is, after all, quite a marginal and challenging natural environment. The other thing I would say is that there's a lot of mangroves in the lagoon. Clearly they were burning mangroves as a source of fuel, but it's possible also they were using mangroves as a source of roofing material. So I think that's why people are living in the lagoon. You've got a lot of building materials there which are readily available. It's full of marine life, edible shells, many, many different species of fish and waterfowl. You've got the pearl beds just off the coast. Trading opportunities, throughout the kind of Gulf and Indian Ocean. In many ways, the lagoons are the focal point of settlement in the pre-modern period along the coast of the Emirates.
Hello. So I would just wanted to ask you about St. Thomas and Tuam. Would it have any relation to Madridi al-Ain?
That's a really good question. And so first of all, the name, okay? Tu'am with a hamza over the waw, or Tawam with a shadda over the waw. Now, when these manuscripts are copied, right, in the past, there's no kind of formal process of copying, and the little errors kind of creep in. So I think in some of these manuscripts, it was written with a shadda, and that's why some people picked up on this idea of Tuam. But Tuam doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't mean anything in Arabic. Whereas Tuam, with the hamza, is Thomas, and still a name, actually. If you go to Lebanon, there are Christian Arabs called Tuam, right? So the confusion with Ain is really interesting, because that actually creeps in the 18th century, it appears, in the Kashf al-Ghumma, attributed to Sirhan al-Iskawi, who basically is writing about Tuam. And he or one of his predecessors inserts a gloss, right? And a kind of footnote, which is not part of the original manuscript that he's copying. And he says, Tuam, he's copying things, which is today Al-Ibrahimeiyya. right? And so then he goes on copying the ancient text. Yeah? So then when the British antiquarians and Orientalists came along in the 19th century, they took these manuscripts, they translated them into English, and they passed them around, and people read them, and it became absorbed into the kind of local knowledge. And when the British colonialists and the Arab nationalists were building the new United Arab Emirates, they were looking for local symbols from the past, which they could use in the creation of the new cities. So they built Tuam Roundabout and Tuam Hospital. And there are all sorts of like Tuam schools and things in Al-Ain, which celebrate this history. But the problem is that it actually goes back to a kind of scribal kind of insertion in an 18th century reading of an older text. So the reason why it's associated with the Al-Ain is because it's just a mistake, basically, and it just got picked up and it became passed on. You know?
Is this site open to the public now?
It's not, no. At the moment, it's closed. It's undergoing. They're building houses, basically. They're doing a development of the island. This peninsula where the monastery and the settlement has been fenced off. It's protected. Other major archaeological sites are fenced off and protected, but other areas of the island are given over to real estate development, and that is ongoing, and it's probably not going to be open to the public for, well, many years to come, I suspect.
I was just curious, are there other archaeological projects that are going on right now in the UAE?
Oh, many. Yeah, many. Yeah, I mean, every winter, basically, from November to February, I mean, all of these foreign archaeologists come and start digging at sites across the 7 Emirates. Every single emirate has its own cultural heritage organization. You know, heritage is dealt with at the level of local government, so there's a certain amount of duplication. You know, you have the Ras Al Khaimah Department of Antiquities or the Department of Culture and Tourism Abu Dhabi, and they all kind of look after archaeology. And you know, there's an attempt maybe to get young Emiratis involved with the future of archaeology, which we're working on. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work going on here actually, and there's some really amazing results. You know, early human migrations coming through from Africa. You know, newly discovered monasteries, ancient Bronze Age cities, the oldest stone buildings in the Gulf region, recently discovered on Marawa, you know, 8,000 years ago. I mean, there's some really amazing stuff here, actually. So, yeah, I mean, if you read the national newspaper, for example, lots of stories about archaeology, which will help you kind of do something nice at the weekend.
At the peak, how large would have been the monastic community in Siniya?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We still don't know because we haven't completed the excavations. The single-aisled chapel is quite small, and the refectory next door, also fairly small. I mean, it's difficult to interpret this because, I mean, how many people could you cram in if you really wanted to? And if you look at some of these Orthodox masses, everyone stands up, you know, shoulder to shoulder. So you could potentially cram quite a lot of people in if you wanted. How many people involved? We don't know. I would say maybe a couple of hundred. Yeah? But then, of course, you've got the settlement next door, which I didn't really talk about, which is much bigger. And that, like I said, is sort of 12 to 15 hectares. That's pretty big. That's 12 to 15 football pitches. And those houses are very densely packed in. So probably several thousand people living in the village town next door, and maybe a few hundred living in the monastery.
So we have mainly linked the church with Oman, having the same sun. What about the other side of the Arab Gulf? The churches that were already in Najran, in Saudi Arabia. There was no link between them and the church here in the area of Oman again.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely they all are part of a shared Christian experience, and they were very much in communication with each other. So in the Quran, there's a mention of the people of the ditch, right? And in the tafsir, it's explained that these are the people who were burnt by Abu Nuwas, or Dhu Nuwas, sorry, not the poet, but so Dhu Nuwas burns the people in the ditch, right? The news reaches the kind of Arab world from a Jacobite Arab Christian of Al-Hira, bringing news back to the Fertile Crescent. So they were in touch with each other. And actually that route, the Wadi al-Dawasa route, which kind of goes up from Najran and it goes kind of diagonally across Arabia, ultimately up to Mesopotamia, was also the route used by the Tanuh as they sort of migrated out of southern Arabia and settled in Mesopotamia. So, you know, these routes of pilgrimage, of trade, of migration, you know, Arabia is you know, tightly bound together by this network of people. I mean, another nice example is there's a famous Arab sheikh in the powerful tribe of Ghatafan, which is up in the Hijaz, right? And they were sort of contemporary with the pagan Quraysh, okay? He spends his whole days, you know, battling and fighting people. And at the end of it all, he gets religious. He's like, I've killed too many people. I feel too guilty about all the people I've killed. And he ends his days in retirement in a monastery in Oman, right? So someone from the Hijaz, you know, so the story goes, you know, got away from the madding crowd and ended his days in a monastery in Oman, which, who knows, Sibanias or Siniya.
For this interesting speech and insightful information. Please, let's thank him once again. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.